This is a new voice for a new Scotland.
Listening to Indie Live Radio, and here we are on Daytime Show again. And this morning we've got two guests with us. First one is Dave Thompson.
Morning, Marlene. Okay, so we're delighted to have Dave Thompson with us today. Dave is the interim leader of the Alliance for Independence, and there has been a lot of talk and debate and interest in the concept of parties now that are starting on the list. And Dave is here to tell us all about this new project, the Alliance for Independence. Morning, Dave.
Morning, Val. Hi.
Let's just imagine that, obviously, Marlene and I have been reading up and listening to different online events to find out a lot about the Alliance for Independence, but let's just assume folk out there don't really know much about it. And can you tell us a little bit about who the Alliance for Independence are? I know that you're having a conference later in the year to elect office bearers, but who are the Alliance for Independence just now in terms of yourself and other people, and why have you decided to embark on this new party or new venture?
The whole concept of the Alliance for Independence marks the yes, which is our little slogan, maximise the yes vote in the Holyrood election, and people have been talking about it on and off for quite a number of years, back to the referendum actually in 2014. There was suggestions it might be a way to deal with things. However, about a year ago, more than that, nearly 2 years ago, I read an article in the Scots Independent, which is the SNP House newspaper. I suppose it's been on the go since the 1930s. And Grant Toms, the editor, did a big spread on the theory behind maximising the yes vote on the list. And that really pricked my interest. And about a year ago, there was more debate about it. I wrote to the National, and then after that, I got contacted by a guy up here, Steve Arnott, who's a Solidarity man, or he was. He's no longer a member of Solidarity. I'm in the SNP, and we discussed the concept, and things developed, and then eventually there were other people looking at it as well. So on the 2nd of February this year, just 6 months ago really, a conference was arranged at which about 30, just over 30 organisations attended, and about 70 people, and they agreed that this was a good idea. They set up a steering group, and I was voted onto the steering group. And we've been working away since the 2nd of February, just really lining up all our ducks. Because as you can imagine, the concept that we're working with here is uniting small parties. We're not just standing as another small party to compete with the existing small parties on the list, which some people accuse us of. They don't understand the concept. We want to unite all the small parties to stand under the Alliance umbrella. And if we can achieve that, then the vote will be concentrated with the Alliance. So if you can imagine, and this is our aim, and we're going to give a good shot at this, the ISP, the SSP, Solidarity, and the Greens all coming together under an Alliance umbrella, which would be one entry on the ballot paper in the list in Scotland at next year's election. If we can achieve that, we would create a massive vote on the list for independence parties. And of course, these small parties, if and when they come on board, and we hope they do, they would be, through negotiation, we would decide a number of places on the lists across Scotland, and obviously before a party is going to come and join us and come under the umbrella, they're going to want a sensible, credible offer from us. So they would need to be assured they're going to get at least one winnable place, and negotiations would decide if it would be any more than that. So it would be to the benefit of small parties who, with the alliance, would almost be guaranteed getting an MSP. And then in addition to that, because if you take the 8 regions and the top 3 places being the winnable places in each region, there's 24 eminently winnable places on the lists. Therefore, the small parties would get some of these, but there would be the vast majority of these places would be available for individuals who would be selected by our regional groups. And we've already started putting together our regional groups, and each regional group will constitute itself, and the members in each of the regions, be it the Highlands and Islands or the South or Glasgow or whatever, they will choose and select individual candidates, and they will also rank them on the list in their own areas. So we're going to have a mixture of small parties and lots of individuals. And the only thing we ask any of them to do is to support independence and to support the SNP government as an independence supporting party in Holyrood after next year's election, and help that government to achieve independence. Nobody would have to leave their existing parties, because what will happen is their party will join the alliance. So they're still members of their own party. The Green Party, the ISP, whatever, would still have all their own policy agendas and could campaign on those issues, but their party would join the alliance as what we call an umbrella party, under the umbrella of the alliance. And they would be allocated a place, a winnable place on the list, place or places. And our constitution allows for this. It's been submitted now to the Electoral Commission. We'll wait for approval in due course, and they take a number of weeks normally for this sort of thing. But I do understand it's a difficult concept for people to grasp, because...
Dave, can I just interrupt you for 1 second? Yeah. Before you go on to explain it further. So can you just clarify, subject to what you're saying, what would actually appear on the ballot paper? Would it be the name of the party, like the Greens or the ISP, or would it be Alliance for Independence, Green Party, Alliance for Independence, ISP? How does that work?
Right. The Alliance for Independence is what would appear on the ballot paper. With marks the yes, I would think. This doesn't need to be decided in detail till much closer to the election. And also our logo, which is AFI above a saltire. So that would appear in the ballot paper. But what you're allowed to do on ballot papers is add a description, and you register these descriptions. And you can have a different description in each region. So let's say the Greens or the ISP, Solidarity, SSP join us and have places on our list. We would tailor the descriptions on the ballot paper to show the support of these parties. Now, obviously, we don't know which parties are going to come aboard, so we can't really discuss how that would be just at the minute. But they would clearly be identified on the ballot paper. The other thing, when they come on board the alliance, they'll be campaigning as the Greens or ISP or whatever, or Solidarity or SSP, between the time they join right till the election next May. So every leaflet they put out, every tweet, every Facebook, on their websites, they can display the fact that they are members of the alliance. They can display and promote marks the yes. So if they and us and the other parties all promote marks the yes, the voters, when they go into the polling booth, will be looking for marks the yes, knowing that as a Green voter, their Green party supports marks the yes, the ISP and so on.
And that would lead on to my next question, which would be, how optimistic are you about persuading these other smaller parties and the Green Party, which is really quite a well-established party, to unite in this way? Are you already in talks with them? Obviously that's something that develops over a period of time, but I just wondered, has that process begun? And because, I wouldn't want to be a naysayer, but I could imagine that, I did read an article in the National, as you say, there's maybe, can't believe everything you read in the papers, no matter what paper it is, but it did seem to hint that the Greens weren't really that enthused by the idea of the Alliance for Independence.
Well, there's a lot of people at the moment who are critical of us and don't seem to be particularly enthused, but then again, there's lots of folks that are really enthusiastic. We're getting a tremendous response. And I think you can tell from the media attention, both from independence supporting media and the unionist media, there's folk on both sides saying this is a bad idea. So I would ask folk to think, if the unionist media are publicising us, but to tell folk that it's a bad idea and we're already splitting and blah, 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 you got to wonder why they don't like it. So in effect, this is what they did in 2016. The whole campaign that Ruth Davidson ran was a unionist party campaign. It's the Conservatives and Unionists, don't forget. And they stressed that if people, unionists from Labour and the Lib Dems, voted for the Tories, they would stop independence. They would stop the Indie Ref. They only had one policy: stop the Indie Ref.
I remember actually
promoting
that infamous occasion when Kezia Dugdale appeared to recommend to Labour voters to vote Tory, which is anathema. I think Grant would be turning in his grave if he'd heard that. I've got a couple of comments here, Dave, from our chat box. One is from Erchie, and Erchie says that sounds a lot better than lots of different indie parties. And also from Ray Crofter, Indie Pram, he says it seems a lot like all under one banner. The SNP, Greens, Tories for Indie, Labour for Indie, Lib Dems for Indie, plus anyone not party affiliated but supporting independence, marching together under one cause. I get it. So they're both comments of support. I've also, from the chat room, I've also got a question from Fiona McGregor, and her question is, will the list parties be standing candidates in the 4 constituencies where the SNP did not win the constituency seat and got in on the list vote?
Thanks for the positive comments from Erchie and from Ray. If I could just finish the point about the unionists, they've been urging tactical voting for years. If you've ever campaigned in the Highlands against the Liberal Democrats, they're famous, you've probably seen it in some other areas too, famous leaflets always had, "It's a 2-horse race." So it's between the Lib Dems and the SNP extolling the virtues to Labour and Tory of voting, voting Lib Dem to keep the SNP out or to dislodge the SNP. So again, this is lodged in my head because I spent years trying to get rid of the Lib Dems, and eventually we did. We beat both Charlie Kennedy and John Farquhar. After John Farquhar Munro retired, we won his seat as well, and now there's virtually no Liberals in the Highlands. Certainly in the Scottish Parliament, there's none apart from Orkney and Shetland. So the Unionists have been using tactical voting on the list for years, and nobody's ever accused them of gaming the system. Pro-Indie supporters have never accused them of gaming the system. Yeah, there's people accusing us of gaming the system. We're using the system that's been given to us, and we've learned. I think it took us a while, but we've got it now, and we're going to use the tactical voting against the Unionists. So to get back to Fiona's question, our intention is to stand in every region of Scotland, all 8 regions. We think people should have the chance to vote for us in all of them. The SNP got 3 regional list seats in the south of Scotland and 1 in the Highlands. And that was on the 2016 results, where I think they were getting about 46% of the vote. The polls are showing the SNP on over 54%. The more constituency seats the SNP win, the less regional seats they get. And the latest polls are showing the SNP are going to win probably another 2 south of Scotland seats. And that means the 3 list seats they've got will drop by 2. And they might get 1 if they're very lucky. Similarly in Highland, they got 1. But what you must remember is this. The cost of an SNP seat in terms of votes to get their 4 seats was nearly 1 million votes. 250,000 votes for every SNP list seat. You give us 250,000 votes on its own, a quarter of the total SNP, and then there's a yes vote in general on top of that, and we can actually get 16 seats for independence. And to me, this is the important thing. I want independence. I'm not content just to get SNP MSPs elected. I want more independence MSPs elected. So even if they were going to get the 4 they've got, and we actually took 16 instead of them getting that 4, that's still a dozen more independence MSPs in the Parliament. But I don't think they're going to get very many, if any, list MSPs anyway, because they're going to do so well in the constituencies. So the rewards for us for a fraction of the million votes are massive. If the whole million came to us, we would wipe the place clear of all unionists. This is a system that was put in Scotland ostensibly to have a different system to Westminster and to be fairer. But they knew fine it would stop the SNP, it didn't, mind you, from ever getting dominance. Boris Johnson, the Tories, are running Scotland just now and denying us our democratic right of a referendum with an 80-seat majority on just over 40% of the vote. If people want to get riled about voting systems, challenge Boris. All you're doing by pursuing that line, if you pursue that line, is conceding that the system that was imposed on us to stop us getting independence is okay, that you're happy with it, and you're happy with a whole lot of Tories in Edinburgh, and that you're not prepared to use a legal system to maximise your returns on your votes. Has anybody ever accused the Greens of gaming the system when they only stand on the list with 1 or 2 token constituencies? Have they ever been accused of gaming the system? And I would ask you, if they haven't, why are we being accused of gaming the system by our supposed independence colleagues when they don't accuse the Greens? So I think all we're doing is tactical voting. It's used all the time in the Westminster elections, as I explained earlier. We are urging tactical voting to get as many independence supporting MSPs into Edinburgh so that we can get our independence. And I'm not shy about saying I'm very happy and very comfortable with using a legal system that was imposed on it. And we only have a very short time to save our Parliament and save Scotland. And this, I think, will help us to do it. There are many Tory and Labour supporters who want independence but can't bring themselves to vote for the SNP. We're also targeting these people. I've spent my whole life convincing and converting people towards independence. 55 years I've been a member of the SNP, through all the good and the bad times, right through the 70s and the 80s. When I joined, you were ridiculed as a bit of a fool if you supported independence. I was involved, I was the vice convener of the Scottish Independence Convention for a year. I was the first chair of the board of Voices for Scotland, which was launched last year. And its purpose is to convince soft no voters over to yes. I've spent my whole life doing that, and that work shouldn't stop. It should carry on, But this is a way of maximising the returns for the votes that we have. Why should people in a system that gives you 2 votes throw away their second vote and not use it?
Can I just clarify your answer to Fiona's question, Dave? Because I think what she was meaning was, as far as we know, the Alliance are going to be standing only on the list. But I think Fiona's point was, would you also consider standing candidates in any of the constituencies?
No, definitely not. We have no intention of standing in the constituency.
Thanks very much. And we've got some other comments from Staffy Duggs for Indy. She says, I think it's a she, enjoying the show, folks. Great stuff. Very interesting from Dave. She says, I'm open-minded on the list situation, uneasy about standing in the south of Scotland because any slight drop back in the constituency vote could be damaging if the pro-Indy list vote is split. But good luck, though. Having a good think about this, as my home region of Fife returned no SNP list seats last time. Could say that having 3 unionist parties is also gaming the system. Archie is saying that the Scottish voting system, in his view, is designed for tactical voting. And Ray is saying, I don't think that 40% representation who only complain about the government and never participate with any budget consultation would be missed, to be honest. Steve C says, we have 3 parties. This is an interesting comment. Well, not that the others aren't. We have 3 parties funded from another country. And so he's all for what you are doing. And he says that if the Tories, Lib Dems and Labour were registered and solely funded in Scotland, he'd have a bit more sympathy with the democratic representation argument, but that they are funded and basically run from another country. Ray says he was one of the 750,000 whose second vote was wasted, never again. So could we move on to maybe talking a little bit about your candidates that you mentioned? You mentioned, the small parties and also individuals. Have you got any idea at the moment how many candidates you would envisage fielding? And I think you've already answered this question a little bit earlier, but you might like to revisit it if you don't mind. Would that be tailored to suit the different situations in the different regions of Scotland and the history of voting patterns in different regions? For example, in the borders, in South Scotland, or you mentioned Orkney and Shetland. Obviously, that's part of the Highlands and Islands, isn't it? But you were an MSP for many years in like Skye and Loch Aber, weren't you? So you know these areas very well. I just wondered, will there be regional, will you be tactically adapting your strategy according to the different regions?
Yeah, well, as I said earlier, our intention is to stand in all the regions of Scotland. And the folk that worry about the south of Scotland, I can understand why the initial reaction is a bit of concern, but that is on a presumption that the SNP are going to do no better than they did in 2016, which I think is a very pessimistic view. And if the SNP don't do any better than they did in 2016, I'm afraid Scotland's sunk. We're done for if the SNP don't do better. And they will do better, and all the polls are showing it. So unless that lead is somehow blown, which I sincerely hope it isn't, because if it is, I can see the demise of the Parliament next year, certainly a major neutering of it. So they're not going to get as many list seats in the south because they're going to win more constituency seats. And we will be standing our people on the list to try and maximise the vote there as well as everybody else. But our local groups, our regional groups, will have a major say in the selection and ranking of candidates in these areas. So I would imagine if I was a member in the south of Scotland and somebody comes forward and says, I would like to be one of your candidates, I'd be saying to that person, okay, come along to your selection meeting along with the others, tell me what you're going to do for the south of Scotland. Apart from supporting independence in the Parliament and backing the SNP government to get independence, what are you going to do for the south of Scotland? What are your main priorities going to be? Do you have any particular subjects that you feel really strong about and have expertise in? Are you interested in land reform or other matters like that that are relevant to the area that you're standing? Or in the Highlands, I'd be wanting to know what they were going to do about transport and broadband links and all that. So these folk will sell themselves to the local members on a local manifesto to take to Holyrood and fight for them in Holyrood. And our local members will choose these people and rank these people. So we're going to have a whole pile, hopefully, of MSPs who are individuals, who are independent, if you like. We're going to have a whole lot of Margot MacDonalds and Dennis Canavans in the Parliament, promoting the things they want to promote on behalf of their own regions. And I think that will be a wonderful thing. Imagine 20 Dennis Canavans.
It would be wonderful, Dave, but you're far more experienced in politics and your knowledge. You've probably got more knowledge in your pinky than I've got. But to me, the big difference there is that both Margot MacDonald and Dennis Canavan, they were elected. They became independents, but they weren't elected as independents. They got into the Parliament under, Dennis Canavan was Labour, wasn't he? And Margot MacDonald was SNP. They might never have got in as an independent.
They got in originally under their parties, and then both of them, for different reasons, were no longer in their parties or to leave their parties, and they then stood as independent candidates under their own steam. And because they had recognition factor, I suppose, they got elected. And they were very effective in the Parliament. And Margot got elected more than once under just Margot and not the SNP. So people like that, doing that job, I think is the point I'm trying to make. Those sort of folk in the Parliament, I think would be good because they're backing independence and they're championing their own regions. At the same time, the polls continue to rise or even stay where they are likely to have a majority in their own right. They're likely to get 65 or more seats. So they can govern without the need of anyone else to back them. But if there was any need, our folk would keep them in power.
Well, listen, this is absolutely fascinating. We're getting loads of comments that are really enjoying listening to you, David. Dave. So we thought we'd have a wee breather. So we can all calm down. Me and Marlene I find we get really engrossed in these interviews. So we'll have a wee. Well, welcome back to IndieLive.radio. You're here with Marlene Halliday and Val Gold, and we're talking to Dave Thompson, who is interim leader of the Alliance for Independence. And Dave has been updating us all about the aims of the Umbrella Party and about their tactics. So one thing I would like to ask you about, you mentioned about the candidate selection, Dave, about how that would hinge very much on priorities for the region. So how will that be done, the vetting of candidates? Obviously you're going to have quite a disparate, quite a varied list of candidates, and it will be from different parties. You mentioned the SSP, Solidarity, the ISP, and possibly the Greens as well. So how would that be done when you have people from all different parties? How would that work?
Well, any party that joins us as a party will join us nationally. They'll be allocated certain places on the lists after negotiation, and they will choose their own candidates. So these parties will choose their own candidates. The bulk of the candidates will be chosen by our members in the regions. Anyone who wants to stand for the Alliance will have to go through vetting, which will be done at a national level by our national executive. So people will apply to be an individual candidate. They will get vetted, they'd get approved, and then they're on a list. And our local regions can then call them, or they can apply to the local regions to be selected or go through a selection process then. Now, we haven't got the bones of that process sorted yet. We'll be debating it at our conference in September. So our members, anyone who joins us when we officially launch, in probably just over a week or so, a week to 10 days, when we officially launch the membership to allow folk to join us, anyone who joins us will be allocated to one of the local regional groups, whichever electoral region they are in, and they will then have a say in selecting the candidates and will be able to vote for the candidates they want. So I don't know at the moment who's going to show interest. I would hope that once people realise exactly what we're doing and see that this is a serious, genuine player, and that we're beginning to interest the smaller parties, and that we can actually achieve the aims that we've set out to achieve, I'm hoping that people who have got high profiles will be interested, as well as prominent local people who are known as local campaigners. But it'll be up to our members in each region to decide who they want. Our manifesto is a very simple one. It's just that we support independence and support the independence supporting government in Holyrood. That is our policy. We will also debate in September the roadmap to independence, because currently our aims say we support IndyRef 2, and that's what we are aiming at. But we realise that folk that come on board will want to debate whether IndyRef 2 and the Section 30 route is the best route to take to get our independence. So we'll have a motion up with amendments and all the rest to our conference in September. So our members, because we want this to be a grassroots up organisation. This is not top down. This is not me telling folk what to do, or the steering group or the other folk that are on our subgroups at the moment telling folk what to do. The grassroots need to decide how we're going to do this. And all of us at the moment, I'm interim leader. I'm in a holding position until the conference. It'll be the same for our interim nominating officer, who you'll probably hear about tomorrow, and our interim treasurer. We only have the 3 people in positions because we have to have them for electoral commission purposes to register. We'll be holding these positions till September. The conference will then elect 2 co-conveners, gender balanced, 2 vice conveners, one for media, one for finance, a national secretary, assistant national secretary, and a membership secretary, and whatever other ones that the national exec needs. So these folk, the folk that get elected in September, are going to be the ones who will take up the reins and drive AFI forward. The conference will decide the selection procedure, and each of our regions will send 20 voting delegates to the conference. So there will be 8 regions, 20 voting delegates, 160 voting delegates, and I'm sure their regions will want to mandate them in terms of voting. They might give them a free hand. It will be up to the regions. And then the parties that join us will also have voting delegates going to the conference up for negotiation, but it certainly won't be more than 20. So if a small party joins us, they would maybe have a maximum 20 voting delegates at our conference, the same as each of our individual regions, so that no small party can dominate the alliance. And that's how we've designed it specifically to make it a grassroots yes organisation. And the other folk that can join us, join the regional groups, it's not just individuals, local yes groups and indie groups can join as a group. And they would go to their local regional meetings, and as a group they would have 2 voting delegates. So individuals would be voting in their regions, and yes groups, we've got, I don't know how many, about 20 maybe in total in the Highlands now, if they all joined, they would each have 2 votes at our regional meetings, as well as all the folk that joined. We haven't reached the stage of having any formal talks with any of the small parties. When we formally launch for members, we'll be writing to each of them, inviting them to join and come and speak to us. But we have actually had preliminary chats with 2 of them, 2 of the smaller parties. We've had preliminary chats some months ago with the ISP, and they decided that, okay, they've got an interest, but they wanted to just park that to see how we got on with getting ourselves set up and getting registered and all the rest of it. So that's where we are with the ISP. But we had a chat with them. We've also had similar, very preliminary talks with the Solidarity. And I see that Tommy Sheridan has come out in principle in favour of the idea. But again, no formal talks or arrangements or anything with Solidarity. So both Solidarity and the ISP, we've talked to them both, preliminary chats, but that's as far as it's gone.
That was one thing I wanted to ask you about, because it has been published. You know, obviously Tommy Sheridan is a character that attracts a lot of publicity, and I noticed that it had been reported in the press, in the Herald, quite a nasty article, I would have to say. I really, not an example of what I would call good journalism, very mean-spirited, but also in the National as well, there was an article, and I mean, I know everyone has their views, but I think it would be fair to say that Tommy Sheridan is a politician, a person who attracts a lot of controversy, and you might describe him as a Marmite politician. A lot of folk think he's great, and a lot of folk think the absolute opposite. I just wondered, but you kind of said that you're only in preliminary talks, so maybe that's not something that you can talk too much about, but I just wondered if you had any comments about that, because I'm sure, we're sort of playing devil's advocate here in many ways, because I'm sure we're trying to ask the questions that a lot of people out there are maybe thinking.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's a valid question. I've got no problem with taking a question like that. And the Herald article wasn't exactly accurate. They said that Sheridan and Solidarity was involved with the alliance. Not true. They're not involved. Mind you, the National repeated that mistake even after being told that it was incorrect. Yeah. And in their print edition said that they were involved. I was quite disappointed, I would have to say, at the fact they used that terminology. So he's not involved. He may be, his party may be in due course, but I think what we have to look at here is that if we want to be an all-inclusive yes alliance, winning votes in next year's election, we can't exclude anybody. Why would we want to exclude any genuine political party in Scotland? And that party will have a right in due course to select its candidates. Now, I've no idea whether Solidarity is going to formally join, whether we can get agreement after negotiation with them. And if they do, I've no idea whether they would select Tommy Sheridan. They might select somebody else altogether. So people should just hold their whisht, wait and see what happens. And, in due course, you'll know who's going to be our candidates. And then you can decide if you like them or not.
Take their breath to cool their porridge, Dave.
That's it.
So we do have some other comments and questions. Erchie is asking, he's trying to be your campaign manager here, I think. He says, would the party, maybe he is, I don't know, would the parties not be better running under Max the Yes? And he's asking, is there not a link on here we could have shared on Twitter to let others know? You've already got your Twitter account up and running, haven't you?
Yes, we have. Yeah. And we're using Max the Yes all the time. Our official name as an alliance is the Alliance for Independence. And although we have to register as a political party to be able to stand, we don't like calling ourselves a party because we're not really a party in the normal sense of things at all. But we will be maximising the use of Marks the Yes. You're going to see Marks the Yes everywhere, right through to the next election. It's going to become the thing that people are going to be talking about. And folk who are already independent supporters who want to maximise the use of their vote and get more indie MSPs into the Parliament next year just have to look for Marks the Yes, whether they're Green, ISP, SSP, Solidarity or whatever. We'll see which parties join us in due course. We'll see who they select as their candidates on our lists, and we'll see who our people in the regions select as candidates on the lists. And I would hope, given that our conference in September, it'll be near the end of September, I think, given COVID and all that, we're not quite sure how we're going to be able to do this, so we're kind of waiting to see that once we approve our selection process at the conference, we'll be starting our vetting and selection processes pretty rapidly through October with a view to getting people selected and in place by November, early December at the absolute latest, which gives them 6 months as candidates to campaign. You asked me earlier about how many would we be standing. Well, you can actually put 12 people on each list if you wish. So you can have from number 1 to number 12. And obviously number 12 is not going to have much chance of being elected. But if you're actually a candidate on the list, an official candidate, you can campaign as a candidate and you have the rights of a candidate. So there's some merit in having more people rather than less. Our local regions will ultimately decide, do they want to put in half a dozen or do they want to put in a dozen? Maybe in some regions there will be a lot of good, able people who can make the case, who will be happy being 7th, 8th or 9th on the list, but it gives them a ticket to campaign, to go on platforms and meetings, to go on the radio campaigning for AIP, knowing they can do it as a candidate and help the cause of independence. So we'll leave the final decision on that, the numbers, to our local regional groups.
Well, that's a great place on which to stop. There's still a couple of comments from Pat that the Alliance have been open from the outset, that all pro-indie parties would be invited to participate in unity to max the yes. If the whole Yes movement act is won, we can repeat the success of 2015, and it does appear that we haven't had it. We've been playing devil's advocate here with you and putting forward other arguments, but all the comments and questions that have come in through our public chat room have been very supportive and very positive.
Thank you.
It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you today. I saw you described as a legend in the SNP because you famously were responsible for the SNP gaining their majority because you challenged the arithmetic of the returning officer and gained, was it 2 extra seats for the SNP when they had been given none on the list? Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. He had told us in Inverness, and we were the very last region to declare that we were getting no seats out of the 7, that the Labour were getting 4, the Tories 2 and the Greens 1. And when he went away and had to come back with his revised figures, which he went through with me and I pointed out his error, they had to change them. Labour only got 3, the Tories still got 2, but the SNP got 2. And that's what gave Alec his majority of 1 over Jack McConnell in 2007 and set us on the road that we're on now.
Welcome back to IndieLive.radio. You're here with Marlene Halliday and Valerie Gold on the Friday daytime show, and we've just been talking to Dave Thompson, who's the interim leader of the Alliance for Independence, the umbrella group, umbrella party, who are standing to max the yes in the list vote. And now we're absolutely delighted to welcome our second guest, who has been on our show before, where he was James Kelly. Hi, James.
Hiya, how are you?
Very well, thanks. Yourself?
Yeah, not bad, thanks.
James is a blogger and political commentator and analyst, and most folk who listen will be familiar with his work on Scot Goes Pop.
Yes, so like Val was saying, we have just been spending an hour talking to Dave, and of course he's talking about the plans for the Alliance for Independence. All of that, success or not, depends on, our electoral system, the additional member system that we've got for Holyrood. So as I understand it, the essence of it, it's a system that brings about a parliament where, the spread of elected members in terms of different parties, that spread mirrors the votes cast for those parties overall. So is that a fair description? Because it's a bit of a hybrid system, isn't it?
Yeah, it's intended to be a fully proportional system. Obviously, we have the constituency vote and we have the list vote, which makes people think it's only semi-proportional. But in fact, the overall composition of Parliament is supposed to be roughly proportional to how people vote on the list ballot. So therefore, the list ballot is a more important ballot. In practice, it's not quite as simple as that because there are more constituency seats than list seats, which was a deliberate decision by the Labour Party to try and make sure it wasn't a fully proportional system, because they thought if it was slanted towards the constituencies, it would favour the Labour Party and make it easier for the Labour Party not necessarily to get a majority, but to get very close to one and be the dominant party. So in some countries that use this system, it's called mixed member proportional in other countries like New Zealand.
New Zealand, yeah.
And particularly in Germany, where this system originated, there's now a situation where extra list seats will be added if that's needed to make the result overall proportional to how people voted on the list ballot. We don't have that. Again, that's a deliberate decision by the Labour Party to try and give themselves a bit of an advantage, but that now works more in the favour of the SNP, assuming the SNP dominate the constituency vote.
Yeah, because it's 73 constituency seats, isn't it?
73 constituency seats and 56
yeah.
list seats. So really, ideally, to get a proportional outcome, it should be like 50-50. And in addition to that, we allocate our list seats regionally rather than nationally, and that again makes it less likely to produce a fully proportional outcome. Yeah. So it's like a kind of, it's not a semi-proportional system, but it's not fully proportional. It's kind of like, 80% proportional, something like that. It's like a kind of wrinkle is built into the system to not make it entirely proportional.
Yeah. So why was that? I mean, why have the two ballots? Why not just have a proportional system based on?
I suppose there's this fixation in the UK that we have a tradition of direct constituency representation, and it was quite difficult for people to give up on the idea of having your MSP, your constituency MSP. So the idea is that AMS is the best of both worlds because you get a proportional outcome, an almost proportional outcome, and you still have that direct constituency link, albeit there are quite a significant proportion of members who do not represent a constituency. So it does introduce that unusual element from a UK point of view.
Yeah, it's true actually, because whenever I'm wanting to, say anything or send a letter to local MSPs, I sort of pass the time thinking, well, I'll maybe write to everyone, but I'm also thinking, well, they'll do nothing about this because they're that party or the other party, really. But yeah, okay. So having the constituency means you've got someone that's a bit more recognisably your MSP. That's fair enough, isn't it? You were just saying that the list vote is the more crucial one because it's out of that the proportionality is calculated. So, and that's interesting because it's in my mind, from just speaking for myself personally, it's always I've thought of the constituency, first past the post ballot that was the more important, and I'd always vote for my preferred party in that, and then maybe I'd vote differently in the list. I have sometimes, not other times, and I think I'm not the only person who thinks that way. But it seems like it's actually the other way around. It's the list vote that's more crucial.
Yeah, absolutely, because the list vote determines the overall composition of Parliament. Is the proportional element. This is a proportional system, and therefore what's crucial is where the proportional element comes from, and it comes purely from the list ballot. The list seats are distributed in such a way as to bring the overall composition of Parliament into line with how people voted on the list vote. It doesn't do that perfectly because of the problem of if a party wins too many constituency seats, it's not possible there aren't enough list seats to go round to make the overall result proportional. But that's what the system is aiming to do. It's aiming to make the result proportional to how people voted on the list, not in the constituencies.
So some countries, I was going to say that in some countries, with a proportional system, they do require that small parties need to reach a minimum proportion of votes cast, don't they? But do we have anything that works like that?
Well, we don't need to because of the regional element. So in any region, there's not going to be any more than, I think, 17 seats altogether when you combine the constituencies in the list. So therefore, no party is going to win a list seat, without getting at least 5% of the vote. Sometimes 6%, sometimes they need 7%. Right. So in practice, we have that de facto threshold anyway.
Yeah. So it's kind of inbuilt, but not sort of explicit, as it were.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Val, what were you thinking there?
Well, I was actually going to say that there was a question that I had been going to ask, and that was what do you think are the likelihood that by fielding this alliance and smaller parties that we could end up the pro-independence movement could end up shooting itself in the foot by possibly affecting SNP and Greens in certain, not in the constituencies, but in certain regions. Like I did look at figures for each different region, and there are some regions where quite a small change in the list vote for the SNP or the Greens could result possibly in the loss of a pro-independence seat, and maybe the Tories getting an extra one, and that the proportion of the vote that the alliance marks the yes would have to gain was really quite a considerable amount.
I think one problem is that people are using the result in 2016 as a sort of baseline. But the problem is that to do that, you can't just say, all right, if you lose this number of list votes or if you gain this number of list votes, this will be the result on the list, because there's an interaction between the constituency vote and the list. And so you have to know how many constituency seats each party is going to win in a region to be able to work out how the list vote will play out. And also, obviously, how many votes each party gets in the list matters as well. But it's very difficult to predict the constituency result in advance. And there's been plenty of occasions, first past the post elections, Westminster elections, Holyrood elections, the first past the post element of Holyrood elections, where the constituency results have been very unpredictable. And 2016 is an example of that, because, my recollection is that most people thought the SNP were going to win well over 60 seats in the constituencies, possibly over 65. In fact, some people were certainly going to win over 65 and wouldn't need any list votes at all. But in fact, they fell short. So that's part of the problem. The other part of the problem is that, as we discussed, to get any list seats, you're going to need at least 5%, probably a bit more than 5% of the vote in any region. And so you have to be quite hard-headed about this and think whether each of these new small parties realistically has a chance of getting 5%. And that's where the difference of view is. I think the chances in most cases are pretty slim, because, certainly in the case of for example, the Independence for Scotland party, they don't have any high-profile figures. It's hard to see how they're going to cut through. Of course, the more of these parties come along, the harder it is, because they're all in competition with each other for quite a small number of votes. So that makes it even more difficult. I suppose with Dave's party, I think there's involvement from Tommy Sheridan, so I suppose that would boost the profile a bit. So maybe it's not completely impossible. I think it's unlikely, but maybe it's not completely impossible for this party to maybe nick a seat somewhere. But in terms of the overall objective of really hacking the system of getting dozens of seats, I don't see how any of these parties, have the potential to do that. It's very difficult for me to imagine them getting that kind of level of support on the list.
Of course, the way that the Alliance for Independence is talking about it, they're very much, their plan is to bring the other small parties under the umbrella, as it were, so that, it's an umbrella, so there's not any competition, as it were, for those list votes, the ones that they hope are going to be transferred from people who would maybe currently vote SNP. And, and he also included the Scottish Greens as a party that might join that umbrella. Of course, no one's decided to do it yet, but surely, it seems to me that, like as you say, if you've got a plethora of small parties, they're just, in a way, in competition. It would have to be some kind of umbrella situation before they maybe could cut through. Is that right?
Yeah, I don't think this is a particularly good idea in general, but it seems to me it would be less harmful if at least there's not several small parties in competition with each other. So it was mildly encouraging when this Alliance for Independence parties said they were going to be in a sort of an umbrella group and try and bring parties in. But then as soon as you mentioned Tommy Sheridan, okay, that's a good thing in a way because it boosts the profile of the party, but on the other hand, Tommy Sheridan's quite a controversial figure, and there is no way on earth that the Scottish Green Party are going to join any alliance which has Tommy Sheridan anywhere near it, and I would imagine, certain other parties would feel the same. So, it's maybe a laudable aim to try and have an umbrella group, but I'm not sure many parties are actually going to join this alliance.
I think that's really the crux of the matter. That's the $40,000 question, isn't it? Whether the idea, the concept of an umbrella party uniting people is, as you say, it's very laudable, and Dave is, a hugely experienced and knowledgeable and dedicated politician with bags of integrity. But to me, that's the kind of fly in the ointment that can they do it? But that remains to be seen. But will these other parties unite under this umbrella? Because if they don't, then it is going to dilute the vote further. And as you say, it makes the possibility of gaining that crucial 5%, or in some regions they're going to need more than considerable.
Yeah.
More than 5%, are they not? Neither 10 in some areas. Is that not the case?
Well, not 10%, but you might need 7% or something like that. But the chances of the Scottish Green Party joining this alliance, I would have thought, are zero if Tommy Sheridan is involved or has been rumoured to be involved. And the Greens are certainly under threat from all these sort of shenanigans because, in a lot of cases, they are completely reliant on the list vote. They're not going to win any constituency seats, so they're completely reliant on the list vote. And certainly the last time around, a lot of their representation was quite fragile. You wouldn't have to drop the Green vote by very much to lose them seats. And, if their vote drops across the board because people are drifting off to other smaller pro-independence parties who aren't winning seats, then you could get the nightmare scenario that the Greens fall to 1 or 2 seats, and maybe the SNP would be affected as well. They wouldn't win as many list seats, and you could certainly cut into the amount of pro-NP representation that way, and that would not be a good outcome.
Yeah. I know people are supportive of this kind of new list parties. Will refer to it as tactical voting, but I'm just sitting here wondering if it wouldn't also, impossible to call it a bit of gambling voting, because as you say, you'd need a bit of a crystal ball, wouldn't you? If we ran the constituency vote on one day and then got the results, and then then we did it, well, fair enough, we'd know which way to vote, but that's not how it works, of course, and you just have no idea about what's happening in constituencies. It does seem to be more of a gamble than a tactic.
Yeah, this would work if you had precise foreknowledge of how everybody else is going to vote. You need to know how people are going to vote in the constituencies, and people think they know that. They think they've got really precise knowledge from opinion polls, But again and again and again, you wake up the morning after an election and the result looks nothing like you think it's going to look like. Sometimes not necessarily because, the popular vote is wildly out of line with what the opinion polls predicted, but how that translates into seats can sometimes be totally unpredictable. A good example is what happened to the Liberal Democrats, across the UK in 2015. Just after the polls closed, the exit poll came out and predicted that the Liberal Democrats would get 10 seats. Then there was a YouGov poll published on the day which said they were going to get about, I can't remember the exact figure, it was like 30 or 40. And most people's instinctive reaction was, obviously the YouGov poll is going to be right. But, if you're sitting in a situation where you really have no idea, even after votes have been cast, whether a party is going to get 10 seats or 40 seats, that sort of demonstrates how small differences can make a huge difference under the first past the post element, and how you really, really don't know how many constituency seats the SNP are going to win, and therefore you don't know how many list seats they're going to want or need. And you also need to know how people are going to vote in the list, because of course, if you're going to vote for a smaller party to try and game the system, then you have to have some idea whether that party has a cat and hell's chance of actually getting to the 5% threshold. So if you're voting for a party that turns out only 2% of people voted for, then you were wasting your time, and the whole tactical idea is completely bogus, because you would have been much better off voting for a larger party that actually had a chance of winning seats.
Yeah. Looking to a situation, sort of, imaginatively, situation where, the elections happened, and this tactic has had some success, and there are some alliance MSPs there. I mean, do you think it's then fair to say that the constitution, the makeup of that Holyrood chamber, has then been skewed in a way that's not democratic? Because the argument behind that would be it would be skewed because instead of having a proportion there of Indie supporting MSPs, which just mirrored the number of votes that were cast, it's actually been manipulated a bit or increased more than was the support in the electorate. I mean, do you think that's it's fair to call that a skewed parliament and undemocratic?
Yeah, that is a manipulation. I mean, there's no question about that. And if, for example, if the SNP were to directly collude with a smaller party to try and bring this about by urging their own supporters to switch to another party on the list, that would be collusion, that would be cheating, the Electoral Commission would step in.
Yeah. There's
no problem in terms of the rules if people are just doing this spontaneously, but there's no question that it does produce a manipulated outcome if it works. I'm not sure I particularly have any moral objection to doing it if I thought it was going to work. My objection is that I don't think it would work, or I think it's very unlikely to work, and you're taking a big gamble if you try and make it work, because it's actually not very likely. It's a bit of a long shot, and you could have the opposite result of what you think. So I don't think I would have any moral objection to doing it if I thought it was going to work, and if it was going to work reliably. I just don't think it would.
Yeah.
James, I've got some comments here from our Discord channel. One is from Pat Lee, who is on the steering committee of the Alliance for Independence, and he is saying, wait till I just see. He says, is it time for the Yes movement to have a voice in Parliament? That's what he's asking, and he's also saying that he feels it's more attractive to call on the whole of the Yes movement to work together and use our emails and energies to make it happen. No one has ever said it would be easy, but it won't happen if we don't provide the platform. And saying that it's reliant on the effort of the campaigners. In 2015, we acted as one. The precedent has been made.
I don't know what that means. 2015? Is that 2014 or 2015? Okay, all right.
He says
it probably means...
Yeah, maybe it's a misprint. I'm not quite sure. I'm not terribly clear. Maybe if Pat's listening, he could maybe just clarify what he means. He cites Neil Hanby as an example of how the theory in this tactic of being successful. And
dear.
That that was when Neil Hanby was, stood, and he wasn't
Well,
no longer part of the SNP. But have you got any comments on that, James?
I mean, Neil Hanby was elected because he had SNP by his name. I think it's very easy to romanticise what happened with Neil Hanby as the Yes movement taking over, and people were not voting for the SNP; they were voting for the Yes movement. I mean, it's pretty clear to me that most of the people who voted for Neil Hanby were voting SNP. He had SNP by his name. It was actually a disadvantage, clearly a disadvantage to him that the SNP had withdrawn support, and you could see that because he had the worst result of all the SNP candidates, and compared to the change in the vote from the previous election, his vote went down, whereas across the board, I think every other candidate's vote went up. Well, maybe there were one or two exceptions, I don't know, but certainly he had the worst result in terms of percentage change. But he still won, but that was basically because he had SNP by his name.
Yeah, that's what I would have thought, because he only was put out of the suspended from the party just before the election, so late that still appeared on the ballot paper, did it not?
Yeah.
I've got another comment here. Well, it's a question, but he kind of answers his own questions. So this is from Ray, who is connected with the radio. I think he did an interview with Pat the other day. He's saying, is it democratically reasonable that any party who wins a constituency vote is then penalised by up to a division by 10? I thought it was 9. When it comes to the regional vote list, the answer is no. But I mean, that is the system. That is how it works, isn't it?
I mean, it's not only democratically defensible, it wouldn't be democratic if it didn't work that way, because that's the only way you can make the overall composition of Parliament proportional. If you don't do that, then you're just making it less proportional, because the party that dominates the constituency ballot will be wildly overrepresented.
Yeah. So Ray's answer to his own question is no. He says it's just designed to minimise the opportunity of an overall majority by any party. The SNP can receive 135,000 second votes and get hee-haw elected, because that vote has been watered down to 13,500 before being attributed to the count. But that is how the system, the additional member system, operates, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think it's important to stress, because some people talk about this as if there's a cap on the number of seats or list seats that any party like the SNP can win. It's like, the SNP can't win any more than X number of seats, therefore there's no point in voting for them on the list, therefore you should vote for another party. In fact, you can win as many seats as there are seats available. It's just, if you win 100% of the vote, you can, if you've got enough candidates standing, you can win 100% of the seats. It's a proportional system. It's hard to get an overall majority of the seats because it's hard to get an overall majority of the votes. But if you do get an overall majority of the votes, or even if you come close to an overall majority of the votes, you will win an overall majority of the seats, because it is a proportional system and you get what you vote for.
He's saying right enough, it's 9 plus 1, so it is, because you can't divide by 0, that's correct. Anyway, so, sorry James, were you continuing on with that point there?
No, I'd more or less made my point there.
I mean, you do hear that quite a lot, isn't it? It's like it's about stopping someone. Well, these days it's always about stopping the SNP getting more. But it just seemed like there's a lot of time when we just, the commentary about the voting system just completely loses sight of the fact that it's there to produce a parliament that mirrors how Scots vote. That's what its essence is. And actually, I mean, I've looked. It wasn't me, but I saw some bar charts that someone had produced the other day, compare the number of MSPs with the number of votes that parties got in the country, and it was an almost exact match. And we complain about Westminster because it skews the results with first past the post, and we've got a system that seems to manage pretty well. I know it's not perfect, but manages pretty well. But often it just doesn't. It seems to be just obscured in how people talk about it, doesn't it? Why do you think that's happened?
I think there's this paranoid idea that the voting system is a sort of a conspiracy against the independence movement. There was a throwaway comment by Jack McConnell in a press conference about how how it was designed to stop the SNP from winning an overall majority, which is, well, if that was a part of the thinking, I think it was only a part. I mean, it was, the idea of proportional representation, it was something the Liberal Democrats were very keen on.
Yeah.
Certainly there were, in the Labour Party, there's always been certainly at least a minority interest in electoral reform, not just for Scotland but for Westminster. There were a lot of individual Labour MPs who were very supportive of proportional representation. So it wasn't an idea to sort of stitch up the SNP or to stitch up the independence movement predominantly. There might have been a thought in their back of their minds that, if hypothetically sometime in the future, and it probably would have looked a long time in the future because Labour were the dominant party in those days, that the SNP become the largest party, that, an added bonus of having proportional representation is it would be more difficult for the SNP to win an overall majority. But I don't think that was the predominant reason. And in the early days of the Parliament, the list vote was overwhelmingly working in the favour of the SNP. In 1999,
yeah, absolutely.
A total of half the list seats went to the SNP, and I think Labour only won 3.
That's something that I find a bit that irks with me when you see people being all self-righteous and calling people that I've got no time for, like Murdo Fraser, who, I get why folk are criticising them, calling them unelected and, they've never been elected, but that's not fair. They have been elected. What people forget is that folk like Nicola Sturgeon and Humza Yousaf, they were elected on the list, and they wouldn't be turning around and calling them unelected. And I think you have to, there are drawbacks, advantages of every system, but if you do believe in democracy, this system, whereas it does have its drawbacks of, like thousands of votes, people voting in the list and not getting a representative, but that is the whole point of it, to make it more proportional, and it certainly seems a lot fairer than the first past the post system in Westminster.
I mean, it's not even true that thousands and thousands of people vote on the list and don't get a representative. I mean, they do. I mean, if they don't get a list representative, it's because they've got a constituency representative, isn't it? So it's kind of swings and roundabouts. I mean, leaving aside, obviously there's risks and everything, and maybe it skews what's actually quite a good setup, but nevertheless, this, especially maybe this little slogan that's come up, Max the Yes, there's a lot of appeal to that, and why do you think, have you got any ideas about why that's come to the fore now?
Well, I don't know how much appeal it really does have. I think this is probably a social media bubble. I can recall way back there was during the AV referendum on the alternative vote system, which took place on the same day as the 2011 Scottish Parliament election. There was a campaign leaded by by a certain pro-independence website, which I probably better not name, to use the AV referendum as an independence referendum, to basically get people to spoil their ballots and to write independence on their ballots instead. And this was supposedly a masterstroke that would lead us to a free and independent country. And I'm not sure how many people did it. There was probably a few hundred at most. And you can get caught in this bubble where it seems like everybody is wildly enthusiastic about this. But I think you're probably talking about maybe 1 or 2% of the total electorate if you're really, really lucky, and that's obviously not going to be enough to actually change the result.
No.
I think the one exception to this is if Alex Salmond was to lead a new party, I don't think he would have to present it as gaming the system. I think just from his own high profile, his own popularity, I think he would have a very good chance of heading a list party that would probably win seats, maybe a large number of seats. But and I can't really imagine anybody else doing it but him. But I could certainly imagine him coming along, and it would change the party landscape overnight, really.
Absolutely. I've got a couple of questions here for you from our chat box. I'll ask them both. her question is, would the SNP ever have got into power without the list vote? And also, she's also asking about Leslie Riddick, who made a point when we talked about tweaking the system. She said, don't tweak it, just make it completely proportional representation like the EU vote was, and do away with the constituency bit completely. What's your view on that, James?
Well, the first question. Okay, well, in 2011, the list seats were a crucial part of the SNP winning an overall majority. I mean, they won 69 seats in total, and 16 of them were list seats. So the only occasion when the SNP have won an overall majority, the list seats were very much part of that. In 2016, obviously, as everybody points out, they only won 4 list seats, but that was partly because their list vote dropped. It wasn't that their list vote was static and they lost seats purely because they did better in the constituency. It was actually that the list vote dropped, and if you get fewer list votes, you're going to get fewer list seats. It's as straightforward as that. If the aim is proportionality, I think probably the best system would be a pure list vote and possibly an open list vote where you can express preferences for candidates. That's always the criticism of the list, that is, in this country, it's a closed list. It gives too much power to the parties to determine which order they rank the candidates, and that effectively decides who gets elected in most cases. And it's almost like the parties have more power over who ends up in Parliament than the voter. But the other problem with that idea is that you lose constituency link, and it depends how important having direct constituency representation is. It's obviously very much part of the democratic tradition in the UK, and I suppose that's the advantage of the additional member system. Another alternative is the single transferable vote, which we use for local council elections. And that sort of marries the two things to some extent, because, you have constituency representation, but it has to be larger, multi-member constituencies. And so you could say that kind of dilutes really the constituency because it's so large. So it's not quite as direct. And also, I mean, a lot of people who are interested in electoral reform regard the single transferable vote as the holy grail. But although it's the best system in a lot of ways in terms of empowering the voter, it doesn't actually necessarily produce the most proportional outcomes. I remember, I think it was the Irish general election, the one before last. It looked like Fine Gael were on course for an overall majority, and they were only in about 40% of the vote in the opinion polls. So they didn't get there in the end, but that's what it looked like was going to happen, and that's almost as bad as first past the post in terms of not producing a very proportional outcome. So I think there's a lot to be said for just choosing a system that is most proportional, but then you have to worry about constituency link.
Yeah. Well, in our chat room, we don't have a lot of questions, but we've got a lot of statements. People make comments that are clearly engaged by what you're saying, James. So I'll just run through a few. It's saying that many other countries vote for parties rather than candidates, and we did that too in the last European elections. And Ray is saying that's why they may not even win one list seat if the polls and the results match, because the SNP are running away with it. Erche says, I think this is a common view we see expressed, indie supporters are running out of patience, and some of us think the SNP have become too comfy, where they are sometimes a bit too comfy where they are. Sometimes a good kick up the backside is required. Fiona agrees with that. She says she's already decided she's voted in her last Westminster election. And Indy Pram, that's Ray, is taking up something you said, James, about Alex Salmond. I'm just going to read out what he said. I'm not quite sure if it really sums up what he said, but he says, so Alex Salmond's standing isn't gaming the system, but the Yes movement putting up parties is gaming the system. So
that's not what I said, but anyway.
No, it really isn't what you said. What you said was that a candidate with a profile that large coming in would change the situation. Is that not what you said?
Yeah, I mean, it may be that, Alex Salmond is a wily operator, and it may be that if he came in and did this, he would take the gaming the system angle for a sort of party political advantage. Quite legitimately, you use the message that you think is going to win you the most votes. But regardless of that, regardless of whether he was promoting this as gaming the system or not, just in a proportional system where you need 5% of the vote to get representation, a party led by Alex Salmond would have a good chance of doing that, regardless of whether you're attempting to game the system or not.
It's just got one last comment, and I just wanted to read it out because it's very positive towards James. Excellent to hear James on. She's a big fan of Scot Goes Pop. And she finds it hugely annoying when the MSM bang on about the SNP requiring a majority of seats for a mandate without explaining that the voting system is specifically set up and designed to avoid this happening. Nearly as annoying as ignoring the existing mandate that we won in 2016.
Just going back to, the max the yes. So the other way to max the yes is to persuade people who have not yet voted for independence or an independent support party to vote for it. That's the other way to max the yes, to get new people over. So, with that in mind, what do you think how do you think the SNP need to campaign? What do you think need to be in their manifesto and their campaign next year before the Holyrood elections to help max the yes in that way, to persuade more people about independence? And I suppose to keep the ones they've got, but to persuade more people. Any ideas about that?
Well, it's interesting language about how do you persuade more people to come on board, because I think probably the SNP, as we know, the current leadership are extremely cautious about pushing independence too hard, and they would probably think that the way to get more people on board is to not talk about independence. And I don't think that's the way to go. I think 2017 demonstrated, the general election 2017 demonstrated that if you downplay your central objective, you're going to demotivate your own supporters. And there was an awful lot of basically SNP supporters, people who would otherwise have voted SNP, who just didn't turn out to vote that day because they weren't enthused, they weren't engaged, because the SNP were furiously downplaying independence and possibility of an independence referendum. I think in 2019, I mean, maybe they weren't as strong as people wanted, but they certainly went harder on independence than they did in 2017, and you could see that there was a much bigger, stronger turnout for the SNP. So I think, regardless of what pitch they make, regardless of what their proposal is in their manifesto, I think they have to put the independence issue quite high up just to galvanise the yes support and get people actually to vote.
So would that involve a clear commitment to a second referendum?
Until this pandemic happened, I think we would have thought that if we went into the next election having not actually had a referendum, then that would, a lot of us would have said that's the SNP. They haven't honoured their commitment from 2016 to actually hold a referendum. We had the mandate, we didn't use it, we let it expire. I think realistically, people don't want to hear this, but the pandemic has changed that, because you cannot fit a referendum in before the 2021 election. Yeah. So that's the reason. Whether we would have had a referendum, I know people are very dubious, and I'm dubious as to whether that mandate would have been honoured. But practically, it's now impossible. So we have to now go into the 2021 election with yet another manifesto commitment to independence. But this time, it's got to be, we mean it this time, and we are actually going to do it. I think it has to be a very clear-cut commitment that we are going to do this, and we're not going to accept a Westminster veto.
Yeah, and somehow or another that presumably needs something then said about how they'll do it, how they would plan to do it without an agreed Section 30, because it doesn't look like Mr Johnson's very likely to go down that road, at least not until it's, less painful. It causes them less pain to do it than otherwise. So would they need to have a plan how to proceed then?
Well, I think at the very least you'd want to see a clear statement that there is going to be something done, and that we're not going to let it rest. The problem is that get the impression from the SNP leadership when you ask what they do if the Section 30 isn't granted, that what they'll say is, well, that's not sustainable, and it will not be sustainable. And what they mean by that, what they seem to mean by that sometimes, is that, oh, well, what we'll do is we'll just grow support for independence more, and then that will break down Westminster's resistance. But it doesn't. The more support for independence grows, the more incentive there is for the UK government to refuse a Section 30 order. So whether they actually put it right into the manifesto that what the Plan B is, I don't know whether they have to do that, but you need a pretty clear indication that there is a Plan B and it is going to be done if a Section 30 order is not granted. And obviously the two possible Plan Bs are either to legislate for a consultative referendum and allow the UK government to challenge it in court if they want to, and then just see what the outcome is. Or the other option is to use an election to double as a referendum, which cannot be thwarted because, elections are are already legally sanctioned, so you can't avoid that.
So that would be dissolving Holyrood and holding another election that would be a plebiscite.
Yeah, well, in theory that could be done, but of course the SNP leadership is extremely cautious, and so you would worry that probably what they would do, even if they went down that road, probably what they would do is just wait until the next suitable election comes along, which could be 2026. Which is a very long time to wait. I wouldn't want to wait that long.
Yeah.
So you would probably want to look at a consultative referendum first, or be brave enough to do what you said and dissolve, hold an extraordinary early election for Holyrood, maybe in 2023 or 2022 even, to gain an independence mandate that way.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like we're all kind of agreeing that kicking a referendum into the wrong glass isn't really an option this time, and even though you might use COVID and coronavirus crisis and the economy, hit to the economy as a bit of camouflage, but when would the next one now? 2026. Such a long time. Yeah.
There is a Westminster election due in 2024, but even that's a long way away, and I don't think it's a good idea to use a Westminster election to try and gain an independence mandate, because you'd get all mixed up with British issues. So I think it really has to be a dedicated Scottish vote, which means either a consultative referendum or a Holyrood election.
Yep.
Yeah. Fiona's saying that we might not have a Holyrood left by 2023, the way things are, the way they're coming after, and undermining our democracy, really.
Yes, that's a good point, isn't it? Because they do seem to be rather kind of hell-bent on that, and well, at least doing it a bit slickly, actually not kind of shutting down Holyrood, but doing it in the way that seems to be coming through at the moment, whereby instead of transferring funds to Holyrood to spend, they'll keep that money, and then the so-called UK government in Scotland spends it on our behalf, but that means then they spend it in the way that they decide. Tricky, isn't it? Because all of that you'd kind of assume would carry on increasing support for independence, but time's marching on as well, actually. So, as regards the independence.
So, James, we're very grateful to you again for coming on and talking to us on the Daytime Show. I hope you'll maybe come on again some point in a month or so in the future, and it's always great to hear your take on everything. We read your blogs quite regularly, that's for sure.
Okay, no problem. It was good to be on, and thanks for inviting me again.
This is a new voice for a new Scotland.
Radio.